When Quentin Ward went off the roof of the germplasm repository, his left hand was locked around a bag of rice seed. The man who pushed him was Max Harwood. The undergraduate Quentin had personally carried from the agronomy college, the last student he ever took on 15 years of teaching him everything from hybrid breeding to gene editing. The young man he'd pointed to at the International Crop Science Congress and told his peers around the world, "This one will change how humanity eats." In the falling instant, Quentin saw Max adjust the collar of his lab coat with his gloved right hand, the motion unhurried, as if he'd just finished the sterile inoculation of a seed batch. Those eyes watched him accelerate away under the ultraviolet sterilizing lamps of the repository, holding no rage, no killing intent, only a relief that had been calculated to the decimal. As though what he'd just discarded was nothing more than a bag of experimental material with unstable traits. Quentin's back smashed through 3 floors of glass skybridge, tore into the drainpipe brackets bolted to the exterior wall, and finally landed in the irrigation ditch at the edge of the experimental plots. The water in the ditch was bone-cutting cold in the early spring, and it mixed with his blood as it spilled over the field buns and seeped into the roots of the experimental rice plants that were just then pushing out their panicles. Those plants he had put into the ground with his own hands, and he knew the trait data of every single one of them by heart: tiller number, panicle length, grain weight, chalkiness. Now their roots were drinking ditch water fed by his blood, a silent and brutal offering. His spine burst into a comminuted fracture at the 12th thoracic vertebra, his pelvis shattered, his left ear cut through by a glass shard, the deafness permanent. His left hand still held the seed bag. The seal had split open in the impact, and the golden rice grains spilled through the tear, floating on the surface of the irrigation ditch, looking like scattered bullion under the moon. It was the variety he had spent 20 years breeding, Ward rice, the world's first indica rice capable of yielding over 4 tons per acre on saline alkali soil, salt-tolerant, lodging-resistant, grain quality meeting the highest national grade. The cooked rice carrying a faint jasmine fragrance. The variety had no official name yet, only a lab code, QW20. Q for Quentin, W for Ward, 20 for the 20 years he had poured into it. The label on the bag had been soaked to pulp, its ink bleeding into a blue fog, but he recognized the grain of every single seed, on tip color, whole thickness, endosperm chalkiness. Every texture was burned into his mind. He could close his eyes and pick QW20 seeds out of hundreds of accessions by touch, the way a father picks his own child out of a crowd. What Max Harwood did not know was that 3 minutes before he was pushed, Quentin had uploaded the complete genome sequence of QW20, its entire pedigree breeding records, and all its field trial data to an anonymous cloud node. It was the work of his lifetime and the future food supply for millions of farmers working saline ground, from the Gulf Coast salt marshes to the alkali flats of the Great Plains, from the Imperial Valley to the brackish water tables of the Mississippi Delta. If those white-crusted acres could grow rice yielding more than 4 tons an acre, it meant tens of millions of people would no longer need to depend on imported grain. The document was set with a 72-hour silent countdown. If Quentin did not manually cancel it, the file would automatically send to the International Rice Research Institute, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and the editorial offices of 3 of the world's top agricultural science journals. What Max had stolen was a forged dataset whose key gene markers had been altered. 2 days before he went off the roof, Quentin had sensed something off. Max had been in and out of his office, saying he was helping sort the field trial data, but every time he left, the flash drive had been plugged into the computer for an extra 10 or 15 minutes. Quentin didn't want to believe that a student he had raised himself could harbor betrayal, but he made backups anyway. He split the true genome sequence into over 100 encrypted fragments and scattered them across different servers. It was a habit he'd picked up decades ago at the winter nursery in Florida, when all the breeding records were still kept by hand and a single hurricane could rot years of work into sludge. He developed the instinct to make multiple backups of everything important. Every season when the nursery work ended, he divided the breeding material into 3 lots, one kept in Florida for further screening, one taken back north for regional trials, and one mailed to his old friend Ethan York for safekeeping. Ethan used to call him every time the package arrived and laugh. "You send seeds like you're shipping gold bars, triple waterproof bags, and a desiccant pack inside. Are these seeds or bullion?" Quentin would say, "Seeds are more expensive than bullion. You lose gold, you can make it back. You lose a seed, you break a chain that took generations." Quentin lay in the irrigation ditch, blood from his left ear pouring into the water. The ditch had been filled that afternoon from the reservoir, the water still carrying the sharp cold of mountain runoff and a fine silt. His blood bloomed in it like a drop of red ink hitting a glass of clear water, a thin line first, then slowly spreading into a pale pink cloud. From the research building across the experimental fields, he could hear applause and laughter. The entire staff of the Crop Science Institute was celebrating Max Harwood just being awarded the National Outstanding Young Scientist Grant, nominated for pioneering the world's first high-yielding salt-tolerant indica rice variety and opening a new era for food security on saline alkali land. Every word of that nomination packet, Quentin had helped Max revise. He had gone over it line by line 4 or 5 times, down to the punctuation. He had added a sentence at the end. "This achievement is the crystallization of 3 generations of American rice breeders passing the torch." Max had deleted that sentence before submitting. Quentin closed his eyes. He figured this time it really was the end. A breeder pushed off a repository roof, crashed into an irrigation ditch, clutching a split bag of seed, dead in silence. He'd spent most of his life breeding rice varieties, led countless federal and state research projects, walked the field buns for decades until the calluses on his soles were thick enough to use as insoles. Dying in an irrigation ditch, he designed himself for his own experimental plots, mixed in with the breeding material he'd culled over the years. It was a kind of homecoming. He did not die. A little past 5 in the morning, an old farmer who had come to the experimental field to open the water gates found Quentin in the ditch. The farmer's name was Tanner, a permanent field manager the research station had employed for almost 30 years, who'd watched Quentin go from a young technician to a white-haired breeder. His job was to open the sluice at 5 every morning, walk the fields at 6, record the seedling conditions at 7. Rain or shine, 30 years without missing a single day. He saw first the dark red water pooled in the ditch. In the early light, the blood wasn't red but black, like a piece of old red cloth soaked until it rotted. Then he saw the white-haired man sprawled face down in the channel, his white lab coat plastered to his body by blood and water, clinging like a rain-beaten rice leaf. The iron spade in old Tanner's hand clanged onto the bund, the wooden handle bouncing twice before rolling into the paddy. He didn't think, just jumped into the ditch, hauled the man out, wrapped him in his own old padded coat, and carried him on his back at a running shuffle to the University Agricultural Hospital. That coat was a new one his son had bought him for the holidays, something he usually couldn't bear to wear, but that morning he'd put it on for no reason he could name. The lining was camel wool. It soaked up water, but didn't let it through, and wrapped around Quentin's body it worked like an enormous compression bandage. He ran along the field buns in the darkness before dawn, the old coat dragging a long wet trail behind him, a trail of blood and mud dripping onto the concrete farm road and stamped into a string of blurred footprints by his rubber-soled shoes. The resuscitation took 16 hours, 6,000 milliliters of blood transfused, for surgeries. The first stabilized his spine, the second reconstructed his pelvis, the third removed his ruptured spleen, the fourth debrided his left ear. On the 11th day after surgery, Quentin woke up in the ICU. His left ear was a wall of absolute silence. The glass shard had severed the ossicles beyond repair. He tried to lift his head to see the sky outside the window, but the titanium alloy rods in his spine locked his entire upper body at a fixed angle, and all he could see was a water stain on the ceiling, shaped like an irregular rice paddy. He borrowed the nurse's phone and dialed a number. That number belonged to a man named Ethan York, his roommate from 4 decades ago at State Agricultural College, top and bottom bunk for 4 years. They'd saved seats together in the library, fought for the last scoop of braised pork in the dining hall, and planted rice together in the muddy fields of the winter nursery. The nursery fields had been thick with leeches, and every day when they finished work, the two of them would sit on the buns checking each other's legs for the swollen black bodies. Their legs were covered with scars from leech bites, tiny white circles, dense as stars. Ethan said those scars were the campaign medals of breeding. Quentin said medals were supposed to hang on your chest, not your shins. After graduation, Ethan didn't go into research. He said breeding was too cruel, a whole generation working from black hair to white, and you might never live to see a single variety pass certification. He went into agricultural commodity trading, starting with hybrid corn seed. His first deal was selling domestic hybrid corn seed to a feedlot broker, netting less than $2,000. He took all that money and bought imported laboratory equipment for Quentin, who was still doing breeding research at the experiment station, and included a note with 4 words, "Keep going." 40 years later, he was the hidden controlling hand behind one of the largest seed conglomerates in the country, commanding a significant chunk of the domestic hybrid crop seed market. But on his office wall, he never hung any commercial plaques, only a single framed photograph, a yellowed old picture of 2 young men standing in the rice paddies of the winter nursery, in undershirts and shorts, their legs caked with mud, grinning like a pair of fools. Ethan picked up the phone while he was at the winter nursery in South Florida, deep in negotiations for a seed acquisition contract. The other side was a representative from a multinational seed giant, offering an obscene amount to buy out the exclusive overseas rights to a Chinese salt-tolerant rice variety. Ethan was in the middle of haggling when his phone vibrated. He glanced at the caller ID, an unfamiliar number. He almost didn't answer, but the area code was from the small town where he and Quentin had grown up, and some instinct made him press the answer button. When he heard the weak voice on the other end, the expression on his face shifted in an instant from the cool composure of a business negotiator to a shock no one had ever seen on him. He waved his secretary out of the room, a gesture the secretary had never witnessed, not the casual wave of a business setting, but the involuntary motion of a man clearing everyone away after hearing catastrophic news. Ethan walked out onto the field bund, the fierce Florida sunset behind him and an endless green expanse of rice stretching away on both sides. The nursery rice was just heading, the air thick with the faint sweet perfume of rice flowers. He stood on the same bund where Quentin had once stood, silent for a long time, the sun pulling his shadow long and thin. Then he said one sentence into the phone, his voice kept very low, but each word seemed torn raw from the deepest cavity of his chest. "I'm sending someone to get you. From this moment on, there is no Quentin Ward in this world." Quentin was transferred under an alias to a rehabilitation hospital in a small border town in northern Montana, not far from the Canadian line. The winters there were long and brutal, the population sparse. The rehab hospital sat at the very edge of town, and outside the window was nothing but the endless dark earth of the plains and stands of birch. He lay there for almost a year, 5 titanium screws and 2 rods fused into his spine, his pelvis plated together with 3 steel brackets. Montana winters dropped to 30 or 40 below zero, and the hospital's old boiler ran hot and cold. When it was cold, the radiators barely gave off a suggestion of warmth, and Quentin shivered under 2 blankets, the titanium hardware turning harder and more brittle in the low temperatures, every screw an icicle driven into bone. When the boiler ran too hot, the room turned into a dry oven and his lips cracked open in a dozen bleeding fissures. But none of that was the worst. The worst was the rehabilitation training. The therapist was a retired athletic trainer named Nick, a man whose methods were brutal and whose results were undeniable. Every day he wrapped heavy rubber bands around Quentin's legs and forced the passive stretches, and Quentin bit through several towels from the pain. Nick pulled and said, "Pain means it's working. No pain, you stay in that bed forever. Your choice." Quentin said, "Pull. As hard as you've got." Nick said, "All right. You've got grit." And he pulled harder. Once he could get out of bed, the truly long rehabilitation began. At the edge of town there was a dirt road that led to the river, rutted by tractors, buried under snow in winter, a quagmire in spring. That was his recovery field. Every day, he walked that road leaning on a birchwood cane, from the edge of town to the river and back again. At first, he could only manage a few hundred yards, and with each step his right knee emitted a faint grinding noise, like a gear in an old thresher running dry. Then he could do a mile, then 3. Occasionally, he passed the town's residents, and they gradually grew accustomed to the white-haired outsider with a dragging right leg, who appeared on that river road every morning without fail, like a migratory bird that had fallen out of formation, solitary and stubborn, tracing the same path back and forth. 3 years later, on an old street deep in the town that led to the river, he opened a tiny sharpening shop, its sign reading Mute's Sharpening. He took the name Silas Mute. Silas after his mother's family, and Mute the promise he made to himself, speak less, do more. It was the creed he'd lived by his whole life. The most talking he'd ever done wasn't in conference rooms giving presentations, but out in the fields explaining to farmers how to plant his new varieties, seeding density, fertilizer rates, water management, pest and disease control. Every one of those words had been useful, none of them was wasted. Now he saved his words and used sharpening in their place. The shop was so small it barely held one man, one stool, and one whetstone. The walls were covered in every type of sharpening stone, from 60 grit coarse sandstone to 3,000 grit natural water stones, from common silicon carbide to rare natural hones. From the heavy oil stones for a butcher's cleaver to the fine water stones for a tailor's shears. On the floor sat a hand-crank grinding wheel, a quenching trough, and several clay jars filled with different grades of honing fluid. By the door, a hand-painted wooden sign, the lettering as neat as if measured with a ruler. Everything that can be sharpened. Kitchen knives $10, scissors $8, farm tools, sickles, axes, negotiable. Cleavers at $5. The townspeople called him the Mute, and he spoke maybe 5 sentences a day. He opened the shop at 5:30 in the morning and closed at 8 at night. His sharpening technique was unique, both hands suspended, no support, the pressure of the edge against the stone as even as a machine's. But he never used a machine. He said a machine-sharpened blade had no soul. A machine only knew how to thin an edge. It didn't understand the different purposes of different knives. A vegetable knife needed a certain curve ground into the blade. A bone cleaver required a thicker edge angle. A tailor's shears demanded that the two blades meet without a hair's gap, and a butcher's boning knife had to be sharp enough to split a floating hair in midair. Before he started sharpening, he would turn the knife over in his hands, study it, run his thumb along the wear pattern of the edge, and ask the customer a single question: "What do you mostly cut with this?" If it was for meat, he sharpened one direction, if for vegetables, another, if for everything, he ground a moderate curve. When he finished, he drew the pad of his thumb lightly across the edge, eyes closed, feeling the sharpness. His thumb pad was covered with dense, tiny scars, layer upon layer of cuts that had healed over, like tree rings, or like the grain on a rice leaf sheath. Every scar matched a knife he had sharpened, and matched a thought he dared not forget. An old professor from the nearby agricultural college happened to pass by one day, carrying a grafting knife that had gone dull. A grafting knife is a specialized tool for horticulture, its edge extremely thin and narrow, requiring a fiendishly precise angle to sharpen off by half a degree, and the whole knife is ruined. The professor had asked several sharpeners and none would take it on, until someone told him to go to the old street by the river and find the Mute. Silas took the grafting knife, rotated it once in his hand, measured the original edge angle with his fingers, then selected a natural water stone and began. He sharpened for almost half an hour, no support at any point, knife in his left hand, pressure from his right, the angle between edge and stone held steady the entire time, deviation within a fraction of a degree. When he finished, he laid the knife on a pine board and drew the tip lightly across the wood, leaving a scratch so fine and straight it had no burr at all. He handed the knife back. The professor took it, held the edge up to the light, and was silent for a moment. Back in class, he told his graduate students, "That sharpener has hands steadier than any human being has a right to have." Go watch how he works. The force of every stroke is as even as a machine, but the angle is more flexible than any machine. A machine can only grind a fixed angle. He can adjust to the wear pattern of every individual blade. One of the students actually went, carrying a set of calipers and pretending to wait in the sharpening line. A long line snaked out the shop door, town butchers, a tailor from the next town over, chefs who had driven all the way from the city. The students squatted outside the shop for a whole morning, measured the edge angles of several knives Silas had sharpened, then reported back to the whole class. I measured 4 kitchen knives. The edge angle variation from heel to tip was within a fraction of a degree. My own professional grafting knife, which was ground on a CNC sharpening machine at the factory, has 3 times its deviation. The professor was quiet for a beat, took off his glasses and wiped them, then said, "Don't ask what he used to do. Some people come here to sharpen knives. Others come here to sharpen themselves." Silas never responded to any of it. Nobody knew his past. And nobody noticed that in the cracks of his sharpening work, the few minutes while he swapped out a coarse stone for a fine one, the few minutes while the water in the quench tank cooled, the few minutes while he checked a blade under the fluorescent light and set it back on the stone, he was recording, in an extremely precise symbolic shorthand, a complete breeding scheme for salt-tolerant rice. The symbols looked like gene sequences, but were not quite gene sequences, looked like field trial notes, but were more condensed than any field notes. He had invented his own notation, using shapes and numbers to represent different trait markers, a circle for the salt tolerance trait, a dot inside the circle for lodging resistance, an arrow outside the circle for grain quality grade. Over 3 years, the account books piled up into dozens of volumes, each one wrapped in moisture-proof oil paper and locked inside a fireproof safe in the attic of the sharpening shop. The combination to that safe was his old student ID number from State Agricultural College, the same number he'd used for most of his life, on his admission form, his diploma, every promotion review, every document. Only 3 people in the world knew the connection between that number and him, himself, Ethan York, and one man who was supposed to be dead. The old radio in the shop was his only window to the outside world. It was a vintage tube model, its shell gone brownish yellow, the lines on the tuning dial worn completely smooth, the antenna broken off and held together with a twist of wire. Every afternoon while he sharpened, he kept it on the agricultural station. That afternoon, the farm technology program was interrupted by a news bulletin. The announcer's voice carried a restrained pride. Max Harwood was holding a press conference in Washington, D.C., announcing that Harwood Gold had been planted on millions of acres of saline alkali land across multiple states, and its average yield had broken 4 tons per acre. This was the first time a scientist had ever solved the century problem of high-yield rice on saline soil. Then Max Harwood's own voice came over the radio. That voice was too familiar to Silas, the skinny, tall kid who had come out of a hardscrabble farm 15 years ago, his shoes worn through at the soles, his luggage holding nothing but a couple changes of clothes and a stack of agronomy textbooks. Now speaking with a warm, urbane confidence. Max said, "Everything I have achieved springs from my mentor, Dr. Quinton Ward." Dr. Ward tragically lost his life in an accident at the Florida Winter Nursery many years ago. His breeding spirit has always been the lighthouse guiding me forward. His voice paused, carrying a carefully controlled choke. I still remember the last time I saw Dr. Ward. It was in the experimental field at the Winter Nursery. He was crouched on the bund, hand-pollinating a rice plant. He turned back and said to me, "Max, if this plant can be successfully bred, we can grow grain on America's salt ground." I've kept those words in my heart all these years. Today, I want to say to Dr. Ward, "Teacher, your rice, I've grown it for you." A reporter asked whether Dr. Ward had left any unfinished breeding material. Max's voice dropped slightly, carrying a carefully measured restraint and regret. In his later years, Dr. Ward's health was poor. Long-term field work left him with severe rheumatism and ear disease. His hearing deteriorated badly. Every time we students went into the field with him, we had to practically shout. He left almost no complete breeding records. A great deal of precious material was lost with him. That is the regret of all of us who were his students. Silas was in the middle of sharpening an old high-carbon steel chef's knife. It had been brought in by a retired line cook, the blade worn down almost by half, its edge notched in several places. When Max's voice on the radio said the words, "ear disease," Silas lifted the knife from the stone and held it under the fluorescent light to check the mirror polish of the edge. The blade reflected back his own stretched-out silhouette, white-haired, face carved with deep lines. His left ear was absolute silence. In his right ear, the radio broadcast mingled with the wind blowing down the old street. He wrote a string of symbols in his account book, stood up, and stretched his rigid spine. Montana winters stretched on as if they had no end, cold of 40 below splitting the flagstones of the town streets and making the titanium screws in his spine ache with a dull throb. Every overcast day, every snowy day, the bone around the screws produced a blunt, sour pressure, like something slowly tightening inside the marrow. He pulled out a phone and dialed a number. A young man's voice answered, thick with the Northern Plains accent. "Silas, I've traced every single one of Max Harwood's international collaboration deals. He sold the overseas technology license for Harwood Gold to multiple multinational seed giants. Total contract value in the hundreds of millions. One deal is an exclusive variety license, another is a trade secret transfer, a third is a joint venture for overseas production. But I ran the comparison. The parental source of his Harwood Gold matches the original parents of QW20 that Dr. Ward described in his internal reports, right down to the molecular markers. Especially the maternal line, that's a natural salt-tolerant accession Dr. Ward found in a wild rice population in an abandoned Florida salt pan 20 years ago. That material exists nowhere else in the world. In Max's published records, he claims he introduced it himself from IRI. He's lying. The young man's name was Tanner Jakes, the grandson of the old tanner who had pulled Quinton out of the irrigation ditch. He had grown up around the experimental fields, watching Quinton do hybridization work as a kid, squatting nearby and helping bag panicles, hang tags, and take notes. He had an eye for trait segregation that most professors lacked. In a field of several thousand plants, he could pick out at a glance which ones differed from the rest in plant type, leaf color, and tiller number. He was studying crop genetics and breeding at Montana State, and every spare hour he spent in the university's experimental fields and gene sequencing lab. He was Quinton's only ally in that border town. A knife sharpener and an undergraduate breeding student, they made an oddly effective team. Silas was quiet for a moment. He rinsed the finished chef's knife in clean water, dried it with a cloth, and wiped on a thin coat of rust-preventive oil. The notches in the blade had been ground smooth. The whole knife looked as though it had been given a new skeleton. The maternal line of QW20 I found in an abandoned salt pan outside of Tampa. The salt concentration in that pan was nearly twice that of seawater, white crust everywhere, crunching underfoot like broken bone. Every domesticated variety was dead. Even the most salt-tolerant indica couldn't survive past the seedling stage. Only those few wild rice plants were still alive, growing along the drainage ditch at the edge of the pan, stubby and thin, their panicles no bigger than a sparrow's head. But I peeled a grain and chewed it, and I knew right away, the hull had a particular sweetness no ordinary wild rice carries. I crouched on the bund looking at those plants for an entire afternoon. The sun burned the back of my neck raw, but I was afraid to leave. Afraid that if I walked away, someone would pull those plants as weeds. Max's paper lists the maternal source, but he got the collection site wrong. He wrote Texas. Because he doesn't know that salt pan is in Florida, not Texas. He's never been there. He stole all his data from my office. He stole my gene sequences, but he can't steal the salt ground I walked on. On the other end of the line, Tanner drew a sharp breath. The cold wind of a Montana night hissed through the phone speaker, mixing with his tight-held breathing. He was silent for a moment, then asked, "Silas, who are you really?" Silas didn't answer. He put the last sharpening stone back into the wooden chest, pulled the dust cover over it, every motion unhurried, but precisely placed, the way you'd emasculate a rice floret. He wiped the workbench clean with a rag. The surface held a fine layer of iron filings that glittered under the light like crushed stars. Tell your grandpa Ethan to start the short. Also, send the genome comparison report between Harwood Gold and QW20 anonymously to IRI and the editorial board of Nature Genetics. And attach the DNA fingerprint profile of that seed bag your grandpa fished out of the irrigation ditch. Most of those seeds were soaked, but didn't die. Your grandpa planted a row of them in the field by himself and saved the seed. Those seeds are the oldest ironclad proof. Tanner said, already in progress. I ran the genome comparison for almost 2 months, whole genome coverage over 99%. The results show that Harwood Gold and QW20 are virtually identical across the whole genome, far exceeding the similarity ceiling that independent breeding could possibly produce. I've verified the analysis multiple times. The conclusion is indisputable. 1 week later, the International Seed Expo, Miami, Florida. Winter in Miami was the busiest season for the town. The International Seed Expo was one of the top global gatherings of the seed industry, and this year it had landed in Miami, drawing hundreds of seed giants, research institutions, and international organizations from dozens of countries. Max Harwood had booked the entire main exhibition hall for the global launch of Harwood Gold. At the entrance stood an enormous LED wall, cycling a documentary about him. The camera pushed slowly across a white-crusted salt flat, past withered seedlings and cracked earth, and finally settled on a rippling golden rice field. Max stood in the field, cradling a heavy panicle of rice, smiling into the lens. The voiceover intoned in epic cadence. From salt waste to high-yield field, Max Harwood has traveled in 20 years the road that took generations. Max wore a tailored navy suit, the commemorative gold pen the organizers had gifted tucked into his breast pocket, and stood before the giant LED screen. The screen displayed the global promotion map for Harwood Gold, saline alkali regions across the country, the Gulf Coast, the alkali basins of the Great Plains, the brackish margins of the Mississippi Delta, plus coastal zones in Southeast Asia, the Ganges Delta in Bangladesh, and the Nile Delta in Egypt. He used a laser pointer to touch the dense markers and narrated how he had started from a single wild rice plant and, step by step, used marker-assisted selection and gene editing to crack the century-old problem of high-yield rice on saline soils. His account was dense with data, the logic clean. The international colleagues in the audience nodded along. At the emotional peak, his voice trembled. The year Dr. Ward left us at the winter nursery, I stood for a long time in his experimental field. I spoke to those rice plants that hadn't yet headed. I said, "Teacher, I swear I will let you see this day." He paused for a long beat, lowered his head, and wiped the corner of his eye. The hall was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning cycling. He lifted his head and continued, "Today, I bring Harwood Gold to Miami, this place where Dr. Ward once struggled. I want to use this field to tell the world, America's salt ground is no longer barren." Applause crashed. In the center of the front row sat a young woman in a teal dress, holding a bouquet made of real Harwood Gold panicles, the golden grains gleaming softly under the lights. She was Max's wife and the chief operating officer of Harwood Genetics, Lena. Max's eyes met hers in the air, and the corner of her mouth curved in a way only the two of them could read. The instant Max pressed the remote to play the global launch video, every light in the exhibition hall went out. Not a break or trip, because outside the hall, the lights of the fishing boats on Biscayne Bay were still burning. Only this hall. The emergency lighting didn't come on. Every electronic screen went black. Every phone went dead. Someone screamed in the dark. Someone tried to turn on a phone flashlight and couldn't. The darkness lasted about 20 seconds. Then, outside the window, the giant LED facade wrapping the tower across the bay, a landmark high-rise that usually displayed city promotions and tourism ads, lit up. The whole curved surface turned a pure white. On that white, a line of black text appeared, in the fixed-width font of a lab notebook, cold, as if captured directly from the screen of a sequencer. "Max Harwood, do you remember the bag of seeds whose label you tore off?" Max froze at center stage. The remote slipped from his fingers, hit the stage floor, and skittered under the podium. The facade continued. Years ago, on the roof of the germplasm repository at the Florida Winter Nursery, you altered my field data, tore the label off QW20, and pushed me off the roof. You thought I was dead. I am not. Today, I have come to take back what you stole from me. Not revenge, breeding. You have promoted a plagiarized, falsified breeding result for years. Every farmer who chose the wrong planting plan because of your fake data, every acre of saline ground that lost yield because of your defective variety, every consumer deceived by your lies, that is all on your head. The hall erupted. International media reporters rushed madly to the floor-to-ceiling windows and raised their phones to take photos, but the phones were still black. Someone tried to open a laptop, but the signal was jammed. Only the text on the tower across the bay burned cold in the night sky, each stroke as if cut with a scalpel on black velvet. The tourists on the Miami beachfront stopped and craned their necks. Some began taking photos with actual cameras. The cameras were not jammed, and flashes rippled across the sand like stars tipped onto the sea. Max whipped toward backstage and shouted, "Shut down that tower screen. Call the police." The voice fed through his earpiece to the control room, but no one responded. Inside the control room, a technical team that Ethan York had placed in advance had legally taken over the building's display system, not a hack, a legitimate takeover. Ethan's conglomerate had obtained the temporary usage rights for that LED facade a month earlier under the sponsorship of the International Seed Expo. His commercial instincts were such that he never walked into a fight he hadn't already won. The facade began playing the first piece of evidence. Scanned pages of Quintin Ward's original breeding notebooks, yellowed experiment log paper, revisions alternating between pen and pencil, every page bearing Quintin's signature and a date in the bottom right corner. The earliest pages were dated nearly 20 years ago, recording the original habitat description of those wild salt-tolerant rice plants he'd found in the abandoned Florida salt pan, soil salinity test data, and single plant selection records. The entries were written in first person, in the tone of a field journal, not a research report, but one man talking to a few rice plants. Then the complete pedigree chart of QW20, from the wild rice to the F1 cross, through successive backcrosses, multiple generations of selfing to homozygosity, to the final selected line. Every generation noted the selection site, population size, selection criteria, and the tag numbers of the selected individual plants. The pedigrees span the whole country, the winter nursery in Florida, the salt-tolerance screening plots in Louisiana, the coastal marsh trial station in Texas, the alkali soil demonstration area in the Central Valley. Every location Quintin had visited himself, every selected plant he had chosen with his own hands. Portions of the pedigree were highlighted in red, steps that Max, in his published papers, had claimed to have performed independently elsewhere, but which in fact were direct copies of Quintin's original records. Next came the whole genome sequence comparison report between Harwood Gold and QW20. Tanner Jakes had done the work. The report included phylogenetic trees and principal component analysis using genome-wide SNP markers, and the conclusion was annotated in both English and Spanish. The two varieties are identical across the whole genome beyond any similarities sealing possible through independent breeding. They are the same variety under two different names. More damning still, QW20 carried a unique gene marker, a rare allele tightly linked to salt tolerance that Quintin had discovered during the breeding process. This marker had never been reported in any cultivated or wild rice accession anywhere in the world. It was the molecular fingerprint of QW20. And in the genome of Harwood Gold, the location, sequence, and linkage pattern of that marker were identical. Then an audio clip. Max's voice, with the low hum of a centrifuge and the compressor thrum of an ultra-cold freezer in the background. Max was on the phone, his tone carrying suppressed excitement and nerves. "I've got the full gene sequence for QW20. Dr. Ward's computer password is his daughter's birthday. Took me a few tries. The sequence data, the field data, the pedigree, it's all with me. Contact the patent agency." I want to file for international plant breeders' rights. The other party seemed to ask something. Max's voice went lower. He won't find out. His hearing has gone badly recently. His left ear is basically deaf. A deaf breeder, he can't even hear the sound of rice in the wind. What research can he still do? Then the final piece, high-definition security footage. The roof of the germplasm repository at the Florida Winter Nursery, capturing the full sequence before and after Quinton's fall. The camera was installed on a maintenance walkway to monitor roof equipment, black and white, but sharp enough. In the frame, Quinton and Max stood at the roof edge in a heated argument. Quinton held a seed packet pointed at Max's chest, his lips moving fast. Lip reading made it clear he was demanding to know why Max had doctored the field trial data. Then Quinton turned away to pick up a label that had blown off in the wind. The moment he bent over, Max shoved him hard from behind. Quinton went over the roof edge, seed packet and all. An old man with white hair in the audience stood up abruptly. He wore a washed-out gray sport coat, 2 pens, one red, one black, tucked into his breast pocket, a habit from decades of grading student papers, red for errors, black for comments. He was the titan of American rice breeding, 88-year-old Dr. Grant Tolbert, the man who had been mentor to both Quinton Ward and Max Harwood. He had come today only as a courtesy. He was too old for many public events anymore, and Max had called him repeatedly to coax him there. When Grant Tolbert stood, his body swayed, and the people beside him grabbed his arm. He pushed their hands away and walked trembling to the front of the stage, staring for a long time at the genome comparison analysis on the tower facade. Then he turned to Max, who was slumped on the stage, and spoke. His voice was old but carried the full force of his lungs, tolling through the dead-silent hall like a bell. Max Harwood, I saw your teacher's QW20. That year I was at the Rice Forum in Florida, and he took me specially to his experimental field. The panicles were golden, and he crouched on the bund, peeled a grain, and chewed it. He said, Grant, taste this. This variety can yield over 4 tons an acre on saline soil. He put the grain in my hand, and I chewed it too. That grain was sweet, not sugar sweet, the natural sweetness of starch breaking into maltose under the amylase in your saliva. Do you know what expression he had on his face when he chewed that grain? He wasn't smiling, tears were running down. A breeder gets to breed one good variety in a lifetime, and that's a life worth living, he said. The seeds he was gripping when he said that, and the maternal line of your Harwood Gold, are they the same bag of seed? Answer me. Silence filled the hall. Max collapsed on the stage, his face the color of a bleached rice leaf. He tried to speak, but only a dry rattle came from his throat, like a centrifuge rotor out of balance. His right hand began to shake violently, the chronic tendinitis from years of delicate pollination work, now compounded by functional tremor under catastrophic stress. He clamped his right hand with his left, but it kept shaking, the whole arm convulsing. A breeder's hands, those hands that had done embryo rescue under a microscope, performed emasculation for hybridization in the paddy, run gene gun transformations in the lab, those hands that Quinton had trained, hour after hour, year after year. Nimble enough to excise an anther from a rice floret the size of a grain of rice, now spasmed uselessly under the stage lights, like a rice stem snapped by a typhoon. Lena sat in the front row. She wore a teal dress she'd chosen that morning on launch day. She was to go on stage and hand her husband the rice panicle bouquet, and she'd picked the color that best set off the gold of the grain. Now that bouquet lay on her lap, trembling. Not because the panicles were trembling, because her hands were. She didn't look at the genome comparison on the tower, didn't look at her husband slumped on the stage, didn't look at anyone. She only stared down at the bouquet on her lap. Those golden grains had been cut from the Miami experimental plots that afternoon, every one of them plump. The ribbon on the bouquet was printed in gold foil, Harwood Gold Global Launch Commemorative, Miami. She thought of that morning, standing in the hotel, Max adjusting his tie in the mirror, turning back to smile at her, saying that after the launch tonight, he would take her for a walk on the beach. In all the years of their marriage, he had never once taken her for a walk. The main doors of the exhibition hall opened. Not kicked in, Not thrown open, pushed steadily by one hand, with the exact force of someone opening a laboratory door. The man who entered was middle-aged, wearing a faded green field coat, the breast pocket printed with 4 words, "Mutes Sharpening." He was thin, his hair cropped short, both temples pure white, so white they reflected the tropical Miami light. Slung over his shoulder was an old canvas tool bag. In his right hand he carried a battered liquid nitrogen dewar, the standard lab equipment for storing seed and plant tissue, its shells still bearing faded biohazard stickers and a label that read Ward Lab. He walked down the center red carpet aisle. On both sides stood display panels showcasing Max Harwood's accomplishments: Outstanding Agronomy Graduate, National Outstanding Young Scientist, Harwood Gold Variety Certification, International Seed Expo Keynote Speaker. As the white-haired man passed those panels, his shadow fell across the glossy photographs one after another. He didn't look at any of them. His right leg dragged slightly, and the hem of his field coat brushed the carpet with a soft sandpaper sound. No one stopped him. Every pair of eyes was fastened on him. The executives of international seed giants, senior FAO officials, senior IRI scientists, agricultural journalists from around the world, all of them forgot to speak, forgot to take pictures. Just watched this white-haired man who had walked out of the Miami night move step by step toward the stage. Max scrambled up from the stage floor and saw the face, and every bone in his body seemed to dissolve. He collapsed again. That face, he had thought about it almost every day for years. Not in remembrance. In fear. That face appeared every time he had a reflexive hesitation before opening the sequencer in the lab, in every nightmare that jolted him awake in the small hours, in the corner of his eye every time he walked past that experimental field at the winter nursery, the field old Tanner still tended, the rice planted and harvested year after year, never broken. Max had never dared ask what variety was growing there. Now he knew. Quintin Ward, Silas mute, stopped in front of the stage. He did not look at the man collapsed on the floor. First, he bent down and retrieved the remote that had skidded under the podium, placing it on the lectern with the natural ease of bending to right a rice seedling knocked over by wind. Then he opened the old liquid nitrogen dewar. White cold vapor curled from its mouth and dissipated quickly in the tropical air. From inside, he lifted out 3 objects. The first, a bag of golden rice seed. The Ziploc bag was taped in several places with clear repair tape, the label yellowed and faded, the handwriting water-stained and dried, the ink bled into a blur, but the letters QW20, Ward, were still legible. The seeds inside were gold, each one full and round, like tiny amber drops. This was the bag of seed old Tanner had pulled from the irrigation ditch, multiplied over years of careful propagation from less than an ounce to several pounds. Every grain was a descendant of QW20, every grain inscribed with 20 years of Quintin Ward's life. The second, the complete pedigree, breeding records, and field trial data of QW20. Several thick-bound lab notebooks, their pages yellowed and brittle, the edges worn soft from turning. Every page recorded the raw data of every crucial node in QW20's development, when the cross was made, when the backcross, when the selfing for homozygosity, for each generation, the population size, selection intensity, selection rate, genetic gain, all written out in neat fountain pen. He had locked these notebooks in a filing cabinet in the repository. Max hadn't known that cabinet existed. He had only stolen the computer files, never realizing the true original records were on paper. The third, a copy of Max Harwood's published monograph, The Breeding of Harwood Gold, hardcover with gold-stamped jacket, glossy pages, the cover photo showing Max standing in a golden rice field. Quintin opened both sets of material to the page on maternal line origin. QW20's record clearly stated, maternal line, wild salt-tolerant accession from abandoned salt pan, Tampa area, Florida. Collector, Quintin Ward. Collection date, Collection site, abandoned salt pan, Hillsborough County, Fell, latitude XX degree XXN, longitude XX degree XXW. The monograph stated, maternal line, Wild salt-tolerant accession from Texas Gulf Coast. Source: Our Right Germplasm Bank, introduced by Max Harwood. He held up both documents, facing the hundreds of pairs of eyes and dozens of cameras in the hall, and with a pair of old forceps, he pointed at the line stating the maternal origin. His left ear was absolute silence, but his right ear heard his own voice echoing under the high ceiling of the hall. The original habitat of this wild rice is a salt pan in Florida, not the Texas coast. You got the collection site wrong because you were never there. The salt concentration in that pan is nearly twice seawater. The summer I went there, I stood on the bun less than half an hour and the salt ate through the soles of my boots. You stole my data, but you didn't walk the ground I walked. You never stepped onto that salt crust, never squatted beside those wild rice plants for an entire afternoon, never put the saline soil in your mouth to taste it. Do you know what saline alkali soil tastes like? It's not salty, it's bitter, a bitterness that spreads from the back of your tongue all the way to your stomach. Did you ever taste it? From his tool bag, he took a small cloth sack, loosened the drawstring, and poured a handful of rice grains onto the lectern. The grains were gold, each one plump and round, gleaming under the lights with an oily luster. They rolled across the solid wood surface with a faint rustle, the sound of rice in a fall wind. These are the true foundation seed of QW20. The bag I was clutching when I fell, soaked in irrigation water, but most of the seed didn't die. Old Tanner pulled it out of the ditch, planted a separate row in the field, and saved the seed. Year after year, he multiplied it for me, kept this variety alive on that dark soil. He picked up a single grain between thumb and forefinger and held it to the light, studying it. Under the spotlight, the grain was translucent gold, a tiny, tiny sun. This grain is called QW20. Q for Quintin, W for Ward. It took me 20 years to give it that name, and you tore it off in 1 minute. He put away the grain and took one more object from the tool bag, an old handheld rice stripper. Wooden handle, iron teeth, the teeth worn blunt, the handle polished to a dark gloss by decades of grip, its surface grooved with the impressions of fingers. He had made this stripper back when he was a student at State Agricultural College, out of a scrap of wood he'd picked up from the shop corner. It had gone with him for most of his life, from the college plots to Florida, from Florida to Louisiana, from Louisiana to Texas, from Texas to California, through every rice-producing region in the country. Do you remember the first time you went into the field to harvest seed, and you were so nervous you couldn't even hold the stripper steady? That was your first autumn as a graduate student, and I took you to the winter nursery to harvest QW20 breeding material. You crouched on the bund, stripping the grain off the panicle one by one, your hands shaking so badly you dropped a lot of it into the mud. You looked up at me and said, "I'm sorry, I'm too clumsy." I told you, shaking hands don't matter. When your heart is in the seeds, your hands stop shaking. Your hands are shaking now not from nerves. It's because your heart is hollow. And when the heart is hollow, the hands never steady. He set the stripper on the lectern, lining it up with the 3 other items, the QW20 foundation seed, the pedigree breeding records, Max's monograph. The 4 objects sat in a neat row, like 4 rice plants set side by side in a patty. The left side was real, the right side was false. The left side was 20 years, the right side, 1 minute. He turned and walked toward the door. As he passed the timeline display panels in the center of the hall, he stopped for 1 second in front of one panel. That panel held an enlarged old photograph, the winter nursery years ago, a young Max Harwood squatting in the experimental field, making a cross on a rice plant. Beside him was Quintin Ward, in a faded blue work shirt, one hand steadying the flag leaf of the rice plant, the other pointing at the florid anatomy, explaining the emasculation technique. Below the photo was a handwritten tribute from Max. I was 22 that year, and Dr. Ward taught me, hand over hand, every technique of rice hybridization. He said, breeding has no shortcuts. You select plant by plant, harvest grain by grain, wait year by year. I have carried those words my whole life. Quintin looked at the photograph of himself in the blue work shirt, his hands covered in mud, and was silent for a moment. Then he kept walking. At the threshold of the hall, he stopped without turning around. His gaze passed through the hundreds of shocked, tear-streaked faces in the hall, through the tower facade across the bay that was still scrolling evidence, across the dark blue water of Biscayne Bay, and settled on some distant direction that only he knew. Lily. Your daughter Lily. She's taking her college entrance exams this year. Her first choice is the crop genetics and breeding program at State Agricultural College. On her application essay, she wrote a line, "My father is a plant breeder. He says every seed carries its own story. I want to be someone who speaks for the seeds, like him." She wrote an essay that won a national award, titled "The Rice Speaks Not." It's about the times I took her into the field as a little girl to count rice panicles. She wrote, "Dad said rice flowers are green, smaller than any other flower, and they fall when the wind blows, so no one ever sees them. But after the flowers fall, the seeds come one by one. Dad said breeders are the ones who speak for the rice." His voice caught for a beat. The sea breeze from Biscayne Bay poured through the open doors, carrying the salt smell of the ocean, stirring the open notebooks on the stage. "Don't come to send her off. And don't let her know you know about me. She thinks her father died in an accident at the Florida research station all those years ago. Let her keep thinking that. Some seeds are too heavy to plant in just one field. Her field should grow her own rice." He pushed through the doors and walked into the full starlight over the bay. The wind came off the Atlantic, threading through the palm trees, sweeping across the beach where crowds were still staring up at the tower facade, and gusted into the exhibition hall, stirring the panicle bouquet lying on Lena's lap. The rice panicles swayed gently, making the faintest rustle, the sound of mature grain shifting on its rachis, a sound every breeder can pick out in the dark. Lena looked down at the trembling bouquet on her lap and suddenly understood that she had never, in her whole life, truly heard that sound. He had said Lily. Lily Ward, his daughter. The year he went off the roof, she was just 11. She'd inherited his sensitivity to plants, had grown up trailing him through the experimental fields, knew every variety in every plot, remembered every name, every origin, every trait. She could walk into a field at heading and pick out exactly which plants were the true wild rice parents, which were the still segregating backcross progeny, which were the stable homozygous lines. She didn't know her father was alive. She didn't know that the anonymous botanical notes she received every month, written in fountain pen on ordinary lab paper, in a strong, steady hand, each page correcting a mistake she'd made in her field survey reports, with the correct identification methods and criteria annotated beside it in red, all came from her father. She had bound those notes into a book and read through them every night before sleep. On the title page, she had written in pencil, "Thank you, anonymous teacher." That line had been erased and rewritten several times, from a crooked child's pencil scrawl to neat, grown-up cursive. Almost at the same moment Quentin left the expo, the global seed industry detonated. The content on the tower facade was photographed by countless people using cameras and spread across social media at exponential speed. The first post was from a Dutch agricultural journalist who happened to be vacationing in Miami. Her caption read, "What's happening in Miami?" The attached photo showed the line of black text on the tower. "Max Harwood, do you remember the bag of seeds whose label you tore off?" The picture also caught the dense crowd on the beach, every face tilted up. The post was shared over 1 million times within the hour. The USDA released a statement of extraordinary severity. The department is closely monitoring the events that transpired tonight at the International Seed Expo in Miami. The department has received an anonymous complaint and supporting materials regarding the originality and variety certification data integrity of Harwood Gold. The Seed Regulatory Office will convene an emergency meeting tomorrow and launch a full audit of all varieties certified to Max Harwood and his affiliated companies. We note that the submitted materials include Dr. Quentin Ward's original breeding records and a whole genome sequence comparison report. If the authenticity of these materials is confirmed, the American rice breeding community owes Dr. Ward an apology. The statement added a line that was exceedingly rare in an official communication. The seed industry is a strategic, foundational core industry. The core of seed security is variety originality. Any act that infringes on an original breeder's rights or fabricates breeding data is a serious threat to seed security. IRI posted an announcement on its homepage, suspending all cooperation with Max Harwood and his affiliated institutions, including joint breeding projects, germplasm exchange, and training programs. The announcement used phrasing of extreme diplomacy, but enormous informational weight. We are monitoring developments closely. IRI remains committed to protecting and respecting breeders' intellectual property. During the fact-checking period, suspending relevant cooperation is a prudent and necessary measure. A FAO spokesperson told the media, "We have noted the reports. FAO consistently supports the protection of plant genetic resources and breeders' rights. We trust that the relevant authorities will handle the matter appropriately under the law." The stock of Harwood Genetics, listed on the Nasdaq, went into free fall, its market capitalization evaporating within a few trading sessions. Multiple multinational seed giants announced they were suspending partnership negotiations with the company. Max Harwood was taken away by Miami police directly from the expo. As he was led to the squad car in a rumpled navy suit, his hair a mess, his right hand still faintly trembling, a journalist on the scene captured a photograph, Max ducking into the police car. A single golden rice hull from the panicle bouquet stuck to the sole of his custom leather shoe, pinned between the sole and the core mat outside the hotel. That golden hull looked like a miniature medal. The photograph was republished by countless outlets, almost all with the same caption: "The hands that once did embryo rescue under a microscope are now shaking in handcuffs." On multiple felony counts, Max Harwood was sentenced to life without parole. The judgment used the phrases "particularly cruel methods," "particularly egregious circumstances," "particularly severe consequences" to describe his crimes. The court found that he had systematically plagiarized Quintin Ward's breeding work over a long period, and that in order to cover up the plagiarism, he had deliberately attempted to kill Quintin Ward, then afterward fabricated a scene making it appear Quintin had died in an accident at the winter nursery, altering the repository's security footage, forging Quintin's work logs, and providing false testimony to investigators. The old handheld rice stripper was entered into evidence and later accessioned into the collection of the National Agricultural Museum, catalog number NA 2024. EV0017. The display case bore a note in Quintin Ward's own handwriting. This stripper originally belonged to Dr. Quintin Ward, who gave it to his student Max Harwood as his first breeding tool. Harwood was later convicted by a court of plagiarizing his mentor's breeding work and attempting to murder him. This stripper enters the museum as a key piece of evidence. Breeding is like character. You can teach the variety, but you cannot transmit the integrity. Quintin Ward did not attend the trial. In the capacity of a specially appointed expert consultant for the USDA, he entered the offices of Harwood Genetics to oversee the variety rectification. The day he walked into the Harwood Genetics lab, all the equipment was silent. The thermal cyclers, centrifuges, sequencers, gene gun, all quiet as a room full of stones. Those old colleagues who had been with him for years, those old partners who had watched him wheeled away in an ambulance and later been told he had died in an accident, stood in the laboratory hallway, wearing clean lab coats, lined up in a row. No one spoke. The lab director, Hal, placed a printed variety certification application in front of Quintin. The top sheet was the Variety Protection Certificate for Harwood Gold, one of Max's proudest trophies. Hal said, "Dr. Ward, this certificate. Tell us what you want done with it." Quintin picked up the certificate and looked at it. He was silent for a moment. Then he fed it into the shredder. The shredder hummed low, cutting the gilded certificate into thin ribbons, like a rice panicle being stripped grain by grain through the teeth of the stripper until only the bare rachis remained. He said, "The variety itself committed no crime. The crime belongs to the man who stole it. Rename Harwood Gold to Ward Rice. Reapply for variety certification under the true breeder's name." He peeled the core variety assets out of Harwood Genetics and injected them into a new institution, Return Harvest Seed Company. The name came from an old saying, "Return to the harvest, and the world knows no hunger." A portion of the equity was donated to the Agricultural Education Center at the high school his daughter Lily attended, a sizable modern agricultural demonstration park with greenhouses, hydroponic bays, a small weather station, and a variety display nursery. He had visited it once. The nursery plot held a dozen rice varieties, each one fronted by a hand-lettered wooden sign giving the variety name, the breeder, and the key traits. He'd stood a long time in front of one sign. It read, "Variety pending," and behind it grew a few rows of salt-tolerant rice brought in from elsewhere. He recognized them. They were the progeny of QW20. He made all the remaining variety resources and breeding data open source, free to share with every public breeding institution around the world. The only condition was that any breeder using those resources must likewise make any new variety they developed open source and could not apply for a commercial utility patent. Quinton called this condition the open pollination clause. "Rice is a self-pollinating crop," he said. "Every grain's pollen comes from the same floret, depending on nothing outside, asking nothing in return. Knowledge should work the same way. When you pass it on, you don't build a toll gate. Build a toll gate and knowledge dies. No toll gate and knowledge passes itself on, generation to generation, like rice." Later, the Return Harvest philanthropic fund launched, with an initial endowment in the billions, all of it derived from Ethan York Short of Harwood Genetics. Ethan had moved with the speed of a shark scenting blood. He had begun massively shorting the company's stock the day before the exposure broke, and the chain reaction across global seed markets was even more violent than he had projected. The market cap of Harwood Genetics went to zero over a handful of trading sessions, and Ethan closed his positions with nearly perfect timing. He split the entire profit in two. Half went into the Return Harvest Fund, half went to establish free trial and extension stations for salt-tolerant rice in saline alkali farming districts across the country. He called the stations ward stations, each one staffed with an extension agronomist and stocked with free seed, asking nothing from farmers except one thing: after harvest, keep enough for your own family and give the rest of the seed to the neighbor down the road. For free. Ethan called it a seed bank. Quinton called it pollination, pollen traveling from one flower to another, no money, no contract, no toll gate. At the fund's launch ceremony, Ethan said only one sentence: "I'm a businessman, and this is the best deal I've ever made." Then he walked off the stage. No elaboration, no business terminology. The audience was packed with people from the seed world, IRI scientists, breeders from land-grant universities, county extension agents, and rice farmers who had traveled all the way from the Gulf Coast salt marshes. They didn't clap. They simply rose to their feet, silent, and bowed toward the white-haired man on the stage. Quinton was sitting in the back corner of the last row, in his faded green field coat. Ethan physically pulled him onto the stage. He stood there for a moment, hundreds of eyes on him, and he said nothing. Then he pulled a handful of rice grain from his pocket, laid it on the lectern, and said, "This is QW20. Plant it." The fund assisted farmers who had been victimized by defective seed and supported independent breeders and grassroots extension workers around the world committed to open-source breeding technology. The first beneficiary was a rice farmer struggling for decades on the salt-alkali flats along the Gulf Coast. His name was Len Brown. He had contracted several hundred acres of saline ground, planted with the Harwood Gold, variety recommended by the local extension agent, but for 2 straight years the emergence rate was under half. The white-encrusted fields had only scattered thin seedlings. He replanted again and again, spent money on seed, spent money on fertilizer, paid for water and electricity, and in the end the harvest was nothing. He owed the bank a crushing sum. The house was mortgaged. His wife had taken the kids and gone back to her family. He was living alone in a tin-roofed shack at the edge of his salt ground, walking the buns every morning and evening, staring at the dead seedlings. Later, a testing lab ran a DNA fingerprint on his seed and discovered that what he'd bought wasn't true salt-tolerant variety at all. Harwood Genetics had, in order to expand market share, simply slapped the Harwood Gold label onto ordinary seed and sold it at a premium to salt ground farmers. Those seeds grew perfectly well on normal soil, but on saline ground, emergence was under half, heading rate even lower, and final yield was measured in bushels per acre, not tons. Len Brown's losses went uncompensated. The customer service line at Harwood Genetics never picked up, the local extension agent had been replaced, and the original promotion contract was locked in a filing cabinet somewhere that nobody could find. Quentin and Ethan drove down to the Gulf Coast themselves. The SUV headed south along the coastal highway, past mile after mile of white-crusted salt flats. Quentin sat in the passenger seat, his right ear pressed to the window, watching the land scroll past. The salt ground stretched to the horizon, bare, like wounds on the earth that had scarred over. He made Ethan pull over at one of the fields. He got out, stood on the bund, looked at the white land and the heartbreakingly sparse rice plants, and was quiet for a long time. The sea wind blew across the salt flat, carrying a salty, damp edge, stirring his white hair. He crouched down, worked a pinch of the soil free, and put it in his mouth. The bitterness of salt and alkali exploded on his tongue, not salty, bitter, a bitterness that spread from the back of the tongue to the pit of the stomach and stayed there. He spat out the dirt, stood up, and said to the deeply lined farmer, "Next year, plant my seed. No charge. Keep enough of the harvest to feed your family, and I'll buy the rest." He wrote out an agreement by hand on the spot. The paper was a blank page torn from the old wall calendar in the extension office, the backside printed with last year's lunar dates and a blurry photo of a mountain sunrise. The pen was the old fountain pen he always carried. The agreement had only 3 clauses, the handwriting as measured as if ruled. 1. Return harvest seed company provides, at no cost, foundation seed of the salt-tolerant rice variety Ward rice. 2. Full technical guidance is provided at no charge, from nursery to transplanting, water and fertilizer management, pest and disease control, through harvest. 3. In the event of yield loss, the Return Harvest Fund will compensate in full, calculated on a floor of 4 tons per acre. Only one condition: after a good harvest, teach another salt-ground farmer how to plant it. He signed it, Return Harvest Fund, Quentin Ward. Len Brown took that agreement written on the back of a calendar page and stared at it a long time. The paper was yellowed and brittle, and Quentin's fountain pen had bitten deep into the fibers. Len's eyes moved slowly from the words down to the signature block. The last character of the signature, the D in Ward, ended in a short, weighted downstroke. He looked up at the white-haired old man in front of him, wearing the washed-out green field coat, his right leg dragging when he walked, and finally asked, "Mister, what is it you do?" Quentin thought it over. In front of him was the white-bleached salt ground, behind him the tin shack and the mountains of empty pesticide jugs, beside him Ethan leaning against the car door with his head down, smoking. The wind was coming off the Gulf, pouring into his left ear, that forever silent ear. In his right ear he could hear the wind howling across the salt flat and the rusty squeal of Len's broken windmill. He said something that, every time Ethan told the story later, made Ethan fall silent. "I used to be a breeder. Now I sharpen knives." Later, that agreement written on the back of a calendar page was framed under glass and hung on the front wall of the rebuilt house Len Brown moved into the following autumn. The new house was frame and brick, 3 bedrooms, a kitchen, a jujube tree planted in the yard. Beside the framed agreement hung a bundle of golden rice panicles, the first sickle cut Quentin himself made when he came to help Len harvest the following fall. He'd used that old hand stripper, grain by grain, to clean the seed from the panicles, then poured them into a craft paper seed envelope and wrote on it with a marker, Ward rice and a date. He said, "This is next year's seed. Keep it safe." The second year, Len Brown divided his seed among the other salt-ground farmers in the district. The third year, the whole district's saline acres were planted to Ward rice. The fourth year, the neighboring district came asking for seed. The fifth year, the county listed Ward rice as its primary recommended variety for saline soil remediation. Ethan set up a Ward station in every district, each staffed with a resident extension agronomist and stocked with free seed. The agronomists were new graduates recruited out of the AG colleges, and Ethan paid them well above market with one hard condition. They had to live in the community for at least 2 full years, planting, transplanting, and harvesting alongside the farmers. On the job posting, Ethan wrote a single line: "You're going to teach farmers how to farm. First, you better know how to farm yourself." Many years passed. Quentin Ward's hair went entirely white, the color of the salt crust on those fields. His left ear heard nothing, and the hearing in his right ear dimmed year by year, age-related loss compounded by the old trauma. He could no longer catch the finest rustle of rice in the wind, but in what faint sound his right ear still captured, he could still tell the difference in how each variety shifted in the breeze, an intuition no instrument could measure. Something you could only earn by spending a lifetime crouching in the mud. He no longer did field work himself. His energy went into raising the next generation of breeders. Every year at the winter solstice, he traveled back to that small Montana town and stood for a while in front of the old sharpening shop, which had been turned into the Mutes Sharpening Memorial. The town had volunteered to build it. The hand-painted wooden sign still hung by the door: "Everything that can be sharpened." Kitchen knives $10, scissors $8, farm tools, sickles, axes, negotiable. Cleavers add $5. In one corner, a line of very small text had been blown up and carved into a blue stone plaque beside it: "A dull sickle can be sharpened. A dull heart can't be." That line had been Ethan's. Once, a reporter asked him how he would sum up Quentin Ward. Ethan thought about it and said a single word: dull. The reporter was lost. "What do you mean?" Ethan said he was never sharp, never cut anyone his whole life. He was just dull enough to grind himself into a sickle and harvest for other people. That winter solstice day, the memorial was packed with visitors, farmers from all over the country, agronomy students, breeders who'd flown in from overseas. Quentin blended into the crowd in his ordinary green field coat, wearing reading glasses, leaning on a birch cane. No one recognized him. He stood in front of the glass case with the wooden sign for a while, then turned and walked out, into the snow and wind of the town. The street vendors were calling their wares roasted sweet potatoes, frozen pears, steamed bean buns. The air was thick with the caramel smell of roasting yams and the bite of sub-zero cold. He found the spot where his sharpening shop had once stood. Now it was a stall selling hand-dipped caramel apples. The vendor was a round, middle-aged woman, dipping skewered apples one by one into a pot of bubbling golden caramel. He closed his eyes and listened for a long time to the sound of whetstone against blade. It wasn't a real sound. It was the sound inside his head. The even push of the stone against the edge, the iron filings settling in the water, the quench tank hissing when the blade sank in, that sound had followed him through most of his life. From the experimental fields of the winter nursery to the sharpening shop on the Montana border, from the irrigation ditch to the memorial. Once he had thought it was noise. Later, he understood it was his heartbeat. It was the sum of everything he'd ever done, every variety he'd bred, every student he'd taught, every farmer he'd helped, inscribed into his genes. He opened his eyes and pulled from his pocket that split and retaped bag of QW20 foundation seed. The Ziploc was patched with clear tape in several places, the label faded almost to blank, but the letters QW20 were still legible. He held the bag up in front of his eyes and turned it against the low winter sun. The golden rice grains rolled inside the clear plastic, each one throwing back a faint, warm light. He put the seed back in his pocket and turned and walked out of town. Behind him, the caramel apple vendor was shouting into her phone, "Get home for dinner right now, I made your favorite, sausage and kraut." Her voice was enormous, carrying the particular firecracker finality of a Northern Plains accent, echoing all down the old street. His stride didn't break, and the corner of his mouth moved once. It wasn't a smile. It was the expression of a man who could finally, without worry, stop smiling. The silence he had learned in the abyss, and the sound of the whetstone, had become the fragrance of rice flowers for other people. That was enough. He took the dirt road along the river back. The Montana winter sun was sinking, dyeing the whole river into a deep red. On the far bank were the low hills of Canada, their tops covered in white snow. The dark earth underfoot was frozen hard, and every step crunched with a brittle clarity. He walked up onto the river levee and gazed out at the rice field in the distance, the experimental plot Tanner Jakes had leased after graduation, planted to the 7th generation of Ward rice breeding material. Tanner said he wanted to try it on the cold saline ground of the northern plains. If it worked, every salt patch on the northern prairie had a chance. Quentin had said, "Good." He stood on the levee, the evening wind of the Montana River filling his right ear. The wind blew across the ice sheets on the river, across the dead grass on the levee, across the heavy bag of rice seed in his pocket. He slid his hand into his pocket and felt the plastic of the seed bag. The bag had grown warm from his body heat.